The sky over Dublin in 1854 was not particularly poetic. It was grey, wet, indifferent, much like the society into which Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wilde was born. Yet within the modest red-brick Georgian townhouse at 21 Westland Row, something extraordinary stirred. Not in the weather, not in the furniture, but in the eyes of the newborn child, blinking at the gaslight with an intensity that seemed to ask, what is the price of beauty in a world so ordinary? From the moment he could speak, Oscar Wilde was not like other boys. He did not simply answer questions, he unfolded them like a magician's silk scarf. His mother, Lady Jane Wilde, a poetess and Irish nationalist who wrote under the name Speranza, would recite legends of Cuchulainn and rebellious martyrs as lullabies. His father, Sir William Wilde, a celebrated eye and ear surgeon, was a man of facts and fossils. Between them, Oscar lived in a household that worshipped both reason and romance, science and song, and so he absorbed contradictions like oxygen. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, but that hardly matters now, of Oscar as a child being asked if he would like a slice of cake. He paused, then replied, "Yes, but only if it would not be too great a strain upon your resources." That was Oscar, gilded at the tongue, even in infancy. He grew into a peculiar, elegant boy, a flaneur, before he knew the word. Where his peers played sports, Oscar observed. While they marched through lessons, he wandered the edges of thought. At Portora Royal School in Enniskillen, he was mocked for his dandyism, for his aloofness, for the way he quoted Greek poetry under his breath. But Wilde did not flinch. To be great, he would later write, is to be misunderstood. It was not just flamboyance or wit that set him apart. It was hunger. A hunger for the beautiful, the tragic, the impossible. He inhaled the verses of Keats, the philosophies of Plato, and the aestheticism of Walter Pater. They were not mere text to him. They were ammunition in his lifelong war against banality. At Trinity College Dublin, Oscar dazzled. He won the prestigious Berkeley Gold Medal for Greek, mastering the classics not with dry reverence, but with a kind of reverent mischief. He could, with equal ease, translate Homer into lyrical English, or reduce an entire epic into a wickedly short limerick. But Dublin was a stage too small for such a performance. So in 1874, Wilde crossed the sea to Oxford, that dream-drenched citadel where marble busts peered down in judgment and candlelight curled through ancient cloisters. Oxford was Wilde's true awakening. At Magdalen College, he flourished in the garden of aesthetic thought. He strolled through the quadrangles in velvet breeches and sunflower lapels. He pronounced that life should copy art, not the other way around. He began speaking in epigrams, those brief, barbed declarations that would one day define his public persona. "I have nothing to declare but my genius," he'd later quip at customs. But at Oxford, he was still chiselling that genius into form. It was there that he encountered John Ruskin, the moralistic art critic, and Walter Pater, the apostle of aestheticism. Ruskin preached duty, Pater preached delight. Wilde admired them both, but it was Pater's creed to burn with a hard, gem-like flame that lodged in his soul. If he was to suffer, then let it be exquisite. If he were to love, then let it be like poetry, breaking through stone. Yet even in his most florid proclamations, Wilde was not naive. Beneath the silk waistcoats and honeyed aphorisms lived a mind acutely aware of the hypocrisies around him. He saw the tight-laced Victorian propriety as both absurd and dangerous. To conform would be easy. But Wilde never did what was easy. He did what was dazzling. After Oxford, he drifted, not aimlessly, but artfully. London took notice. Editors welcomed his essays. Salons invited him for his stories. And America, always hungry for eccentric brilliance, begged him to tour. In 1882, he sailed across the Atlantic on a lecture circuit dressed like an Art Deco prophet, green coat, flowing cravat, and hair like a pre-Raphaelite cherub. Reporters tried to ridicule him, but Wilde wielded ridicule better than any of them. When a customs officer asked if he had anything to declare, the now famous line echoed across the newsprint. "Nothing, except my genius." But beneath the public mask, a question began to flicker, one that would haunt him for the rest of his life. What is the cost of being extraordinary in a world that punishes difference? By the mid-1880s, Wilde was both a curiosity and a comet. He had married Constance Lloyd, a quiet, thoughtful woman with her own literary bent, and fathered 2 sons. He published fairy tales filled with melancholy and grace. He edited magazines, gave lectures, dined with dukes and debutantes. Yet there was an ache, an unfulfilled hunger, not for fame, but for something truer. In 1891, Wilde met Lord Alfred Douglas. Bosie, a golden-haired young poet of privilege and fire, their bond would become both Wilde's muse and his undoing. But in that first spark, there was only rapture. Wilde then, in his late 30s, wrote to Bosie with the intensity of a man drowning in velvet longing. "I must see you soon," he wrote. "You are the divine thing I want, the thing of grace and genius." And this is where the shadows begin to lengthen. Victorian England could forgive flamboyance, could even chuckle at eccentricity, but it would not forgive love between men. Wilde knew this. He knew the game was dangerous, but he played it anyway, because Oscar Wilde, even then, believed in beauty over safety, in truth over obedience, in art over survival. And as his pen carved the final lines of The Picture of Dorian Gray, a novel glittering with sin and sublimity, he may have suspected that his own portrait, the one hidden beneath layers of charm and laughter, was beginning to show cracks. What happens when the world no longer laughs with the wit, but turns its scorn upon him? What happens when a man becomes the tragedy he once merely wrote? That is where we go next. London, 1884. The air was thick with fog, and the scent of coal smoke, that particular Victorian perfume that lingered in the folds of every overcoat and curtain salon. Carriages clattered across rain-slick cobblestones as gas lamps flickered to life, haloed in gold. This was a city swelling with empire, invention and hypocrisy, and into its heart stepped Oscar Wilde, not as a bystander, but as a spectacle. At 30, Wilde had finally fashioned himself into something close to legend. He was no longer simply a promising scholar or a curious eccentric. He had become the aesthetic authority of the age, a man for whom conversation itself was performance, clothing was art, and ordinary life an opportunity to dazzle. He once declared that he could resist everything except temptation, and London society, it seemed, could resist everything except Wilde. But even a peacock must find a perch. In May of that year, Oscar Wilde married Constance Lloyd, a gentle, well-read woman from a respectable Irish family. She wore a dress of ivory silk trimmed with orange blossoms. He wore a frock coat of dark velvet and carried white gloves with lilac stitching. Their union was, on the surface, a conventional Victorian marriage. But below, it was more complicated. Constance loved Oscar, there is no doubt. She admired his mind, supported his ambitions, and bore him 2 sons in quick succession, Cyril in 1885 and Viviane in 1886. But even then, there was distance. Wilde was affectionate, even tender, but rarely intimate. His passions increasingly turned elsewhere, not necessarily to other women, but to something deeper, more dangerous, himself, and later to the world of forbidden desire he had only glimpsed in youth. Still, marriage brought a new kind of purpose. Determined to provide for his family, Wilde threw himself into writing. He edited The Woman's World, a magazine that aimed to elevate the discourse around women's issues beyond fashion and gossip. He wrote fairy tales for his sons, stories like The Happy Prince and The Selfish Giant, which shimmered with beauty and sorrow. These weren't just bedtime tales, they were allegories of loneliness, sacrifice, and love misunderstood. Like Wilde himself, they wore velvet masks over aching hearts. And then, in 1890, came The Picture of Dorian Gray. It was first published in Lippincott's monthly magazine, and from the moment it appeared, it ignited controversy. The tale of a beautiful young man who trades his soul for eternal youth, while his portrait bears the corruption of his sins, was, to Victorian eyes, nothing short of scandalous. Critics accused Wilde of moral perversion. The Daily Chronicle called the novel poisonous. Others labelled it decadent, grotesque, even dangerous. But Wilde, ever the provocateur, leaned into the storm. He revised the book for its 1891 publication, adding a preface made entirely of epigrams, each one a sword pointed at his critics. "All art is quite useless," he wrote. "There is no such thing as a moral or immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all. It was not a retreat. It was a declaration of war." And yet, beneath the bravado, Wilde was shaken. He understood that his aesthetic philosophy, the idea that beauty should be pursued for its own sake, regardless of moral consequence, was clashing head-on with the rigid moral codes of Victorian England. And he knew, somewhere deep within, that his own life would one day be put on trial for those very beliefs. Still, the 1890s saw Wilde at the peak of his powers. He turned to the stage and produced a string of theatrical triumphs that made him the toast of London's West End. Lady Windermere's Fan, 1892. A Woman of No Importance, 1893, Drew, and An Ideal Husband. 1895 all combined razor wit with a lacerating view of British social hypocrisy. But it was The Importance of Being Earnest, first performed in February 1895, that secured his immortality. It was a comedy of manners, yes, but also a farce about identity, masks, and the absurdity of moral posturing. To watch it was to laugh. To study it was to see Wilde's private war with convention thinly veiled in cucumber sandwiches and mistaken names. And through it all, Lord Alfred Douglas hovered like a sunlit storm. Bosie, beautiful, volatile, arrogant, was Wilde's obsession. Their relationship was as intoxicating as it was combustible. Bosie craved attention and praise, which Wilde gave in abundance. Wilde craved love, admiration, and perhaps a kind of spiritual escape, which Bosie offered, but only in fragments. Wilde called him the love that dare not speak its name, and he meant it literally. For in 1890s England, homosexuality, legally classified as gross indecency, was not only taboo, it was criminal. They ate together in public, exchanged florid letters. We were seen strolling through Hyde Park with more intimacy than society tolerated. Rumours swirled, but Wilde, perhaps emboldened by his fame or blinded by love, dismissed them. It was Bosie's father, the Marquess of Queensberry, who finally forced the mask to crack. Queensberry, a brutish, violent man with little patience for subtlety, despised Wilde. He viewed his son's relationship with the playwright as moral outrage and public embarrassment. In February 1895, just days after the opening of The Importance of Being Earnest, Queensberry left a calling card at Wilde's club that read, "To Oscar Wilde, posing as a sodomite Assensafartban." It was a crude insult, misspelt and venomous. But Wilde, urged on by Bosie and buoyed by his ego, made a fatal mistake. He sued Queensberry for libel. The trial that followed would tear Wilde's life to pieces. But before the gavel struck, there was still a moment of illusion, a brief interlude in which Wilde believed that wit could triumph over law and that beauty might shield him from the consequences of truth. He strode into courtrooms like a man attending a salon. He cracked jokes during depositions. He wore carnation boutonnieres and delivered epigrams as if they were swords. When asked if he had ever kissed a certain young man, he responded, "Oh dear no." He was far too ugly, the gallery laughed. But the laughter would not last. Because beneath the performance, the machinery of prosecution was grinding forward, gathering letters, testimonies, and accusations. The stage was tilting, and Wilde, whether he knew it or not, was standing at the edge. And perhaps in the quiet hours between court sessions, he began to feel it, the subtle shift from adored playwright to tragic figure, from the voice of the elite to the victims of their scorn. The same society that had applauded his wit now bristled at his truth. How could a man who made the world laugh be treated as a criminal? And worse, what did it mean that he had dared to believe love itself was worth the price? In the next section, we follow Wilde into the courtroom, where the curtain rises not on comedy, but on catastrophe, and where the price of defiance becomes painfully, publicly clear. The courtroom was packed, shoulder to shoulder, necks craned, fans clutched tightly in gloved hands. Murmurs floated like dust through the thick air. This wasn't merely a legal proceeding. It was theatre, high and damning, with Oscar Wilde in the centre, not as playwright this time, but as protagonist of a far darker drama. The man who once joked that morality is simply the attitude we adopt towards people we personally dislike now faced a morality he could neither charm nor outwit. The first trial began in March 1895 in the Central Criminal Court of London, more commonly known as the Old Bailey. The case, Wilde versus Queensberry. The charge, criminal libel. Wilde had initiated it, furious that the Marquess of Queensberry had accused him in writing of posing as a sodomite. It was a bold, dangerous move, and one that would unravel everything. Queensberry's defence was simple and fatal: truth. If he could prove that Wilde had, in fact, committed acts of gross indecency with other men, then his accusation would be not libellous, but justified. And so the hunt began. Detectives, private agents, and hotel staff were questioned. Rent boys were found. Letters were read aloud. Those private, tender, beautifully written notes Wilde had sent to Bosie, now paraded like sordid relics in front of a jeering gallery. Wilde, for all his wit, could not withstand the cruelty of facts bent into weapons. The most infamous moment came under cross-examination. Edward Carson, Queensberry's barrister, himself an old schoolmate of Wilde's from Trinity, was relentless. He was not interested in style or eloquence. He pressed for names, dates, liaisons. He asked Wilde to explain what exactly he meant by the love that dare not speak its name. Wilde, responding with lyricism rather than legal caution, delivered an impassioned speech about spiritual affection between an older and younger man, comparing it to the relationships of Plato and Michelangelo. The words were noble. But in the courtroom, nobility was a liability. Whispers turned to headlines. Rumour turned to evidence. It became clear that Wilde's private life, his secret salons, his friendships with young men of questionable reputation, his letters soaked in longing, was not merely gossip, but prosecutable. Wilde's own legal team urged him to withdraw the case. Queensberry was acquitted, and Wilde, humiliated and now deeply vulnerable, was left to face a new horror: arrest. Just weeks after the failed libel suit, Oscar Wilde was charged with gross indecency under Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act, 1885, a statute so vaguely written it had become a net for destroying lives in the name of virtue. The police arrived at the Cadogan Hotel, where Wilde was staying. It is said that he was calm. He ordered a bottle of hock and seltzer as he waited for them, that even in disgrace he sought poise. His second trial, the first criminal one, began on April the 26th, 1895. Now the defendant, Wilde once again tried to turn performance into defence. He delivered eloquent statements. He stated he had done nothing but love, but the atmosphere had changed. Juries, once perhaps sympathetic, were now suspicious. The very audience that once laughed at his plays now listened with pursed lips and clenched fists. Yet the jury failed to reach a verdict. There might have been hope. Some advised him to flee, to France, to Italy, anywhere but England. But Wilde remained, out of pride, out of defiance, out of some romantic belief that justice could still be found. Whatever the reason, it sealed his fate. The third trial began in May. The Crown was determined. This time, the evidence came hard and fast. Testimonies from young men, some coerced, some paid, describe meetings in hotel rooms, gifts exchanged, late-night encounters whispered beneath gas lamps. These men were poor, working class, some illiterate, most desperate. Wilde, the famous dramatist, was cast as predator rather than poet. But perhaps the harshest blow came not from the court, but from society itself. Friends vanished. Invitations ceased. His name was scrubbed from club registers and theatre placards. Constance, his wife, changed her surname to Holland and fled abroad with their sons. She did not hate him, but she could not protect him, nor herself. The scandal was too great, the stain too public. On May 25th, 1895, the verdict came, guilty. Sentence, 2 years hard labour. As Wilde stood in the dock, pale and stunned, the judge delivered a statement as cold as iron. He called the crimes the worst that have ever come before me, and declared that no words of his could express the abhorrence he felt. There was no mention of Wilde's art, no leniency for his past brilliance, only condemnation. And so Oscar Wilde was led away, not to a salon or a theatre, but to Pentonville prison, where he would be stripped, shaved, and dressed in the coarse garb of a common criminal. The man who once dined with dukes and drank champagne from crystal now ate porridge from tin and scrubbed floors with a broken brush. Prison was not just humiliation, it was annihilation. At Pentonville and later Wandsworth, Wilde suffered immensely. The hard labour broke his body. He walked a treadmill for hours. He picked oakum from ropes until his fingers bled. He was denied writing materials, books, and conversation. Solitary confinement added his mind. He grew ill, gaunt, hollow-eyed. And then came the final indignity. He slipped while carrying a slop pail and ruptured his right ear. The injury would later contribute to his death. After a year, he was transferred to Reading Jail. There, under a more sympathetic warden, he was finally allowed to write. He composed De Profundis, a long, anguished letter to Bosie. It is unlike anything else Wilde ever wrote. Gone is the glitter, the laughter, the insouciant brilliance. What remains is raw, spiritual, and desolate. I must learn, he wrote, how to be cheerful and happy under conditions that are not cheerful and happy at all. De Profundis is not merely a love letter, it is a reckoning with his vanity, his choices, his blindness. It is perhaps the first time Oscar Wilde truly speaks without a mask, but even in that bleakness there is beauty. He writes of Christ not as Saviour, but as the supreme artist of sorrow. He speaks of pain as a form of rebirth. Where there is sorrow, he says, there is holy ground. Wilde served every day of his sentence. When he was finally released in May 1897, he emerged a shadow of the man he once was. His health was broken. His reputation was ruined. He was bankrupt, exiled from his country, and estranged from his children. and yet the world was not done with him. He still had words. He still had rage. He still had a laugh in his bones. But he also had one last trip. In the next section, we follow Wilde into exile, wandering through the cafes of Paris, the seaports of Naples, and the last flickers of love and loss. What remains of a man once adored by millions when the stage is dismantled and the audience has long since gone home? Paris, 1897. The rain that fell was fine, barely more than mist, and yet it soaked everything. The stones, the coats, the man beneath the umbrella. Oscar Wilde, newly released from prison, walked the narrow streets like a ghost in a borrowed coat. The city of light offered no welcome, no fanfare. There were no reporters, no friends, just the damp whisper of traffic and the long, hollow echo of freedom. He had changed. Prison had carved deep into him, flesh and soul alike. His cheeks were sunken, his eyes dimmed, his once luxuriant hair now thinned, streaked with grey. The physical toll was visible, but the deeper wound was quiet. This was a man who had tasted the full indulgence of fame and the full weight of shame, and now stood on the other side of both. He had been released from Reading Jail only days earlier, in May 1897. The crowd at the gates was small, almost embarrassed. He stepped into the open air not with defiance, but with weariness. Constance had moved abroad with their children. She would never live with him again. Bosie was gone too, exiled by his own family and publicly denying any continued intimacy. Wilde was, in the deepest sense of the word, alone. And yet he was not silent. From the quiet of exile came The Ballad of Reading Gaol, a long poem recounting the torment and moral hypocrisy of the British penal system. It was published anonymously at first, attributed only to C. 3.3, the number of Wilde's cells. But the voice within was unmistakable. Stark, rhythmic, and unadorned, the poem was unlike any of Wilde's previous work. There was no gilded wit, no velvet phrases, only pain. "Yet each man kills the thing he loves," he wrote. "Some do it with a bitter look, some with a flattering word. The coward does it with a kiss, the brave man with a sword." It sold well. But Wilde saw none of the profits. Financially, he was ruined. All that remained of his former wealth had been eaten up by legal fees, fines, and debt collectors. His possessions had been auctioned off, his books, his furniture, even his cherished manuscripts. Wandering the continent under the alias Sebastian Melmoth, a nod to Saint Sebastian and the Gothic hero of Melmoth the Wanderer. Wilde had drifted from city to city, Paris, Dieppe, Naples, back to Paris. He stayed in cheap hotels and borrowed rooms, often dependent on the charity of friends or occasional royalties. Each move seemed tinged with desperation. Each new lodging was smaller, dimmer. And yet in exile, Wilde remained Wilde. He still wore velvet, though frayed. He still entertained cafe-goers with epigrams, though less often. He still scribbled verses and letters, though now with a trembling hand. There was, even in ruin, a faint glow of the old brilliance, like candlelight behind frosted glass. But what stung deepest was the silence of his former world. Literary salons in London had closed. The society hostesses who once courted his presence now pretended not to remember him. Editors rejected his submissions. Newspapers lampooned him with increasing cruelty. Even his old Oxford acquaintances kept their distance. Only a few stood by him. Robert Ross, his steadfast friend and first lover, remained a loyal companion, organising what little income Wilde could still earn, defending his name in print, and ensuring that The Ballad of Reading Gaol reached the public. Ross would one day be the architect of Wilde's literary resurrection, but for now he was just trying to keep him alive. There was also a brief, doomed reunion with Bosie in Naples later that year. The two men met again in secret, away from the press, and tried to rekindle what they once had. They stayed in a small villa, living under the guise of anonymity. For a moment, it seemed like something tender might return, some flicker of the passion that once consumed them. But it didn't last. Bosie's family, fearing scandal, cut his allowance. Wilde, already drowning in debt, couldn't support them both. Tempers flared, accusations were made, old wounds reopened, and once again they parted, this time for good. The world moved on. The fin de siècle was giving way to the Edwardian era. The aesthetes of the 1890s were fading, their salons replaced by sterner intellectuals, their champagne by politics. Wilde, once the symbol of decadent brilliance, was now a cautionary tale whispered in backrooms and newspaper columns. He spent his days walking the streets of Paris, feeding pigeons in the Jardin du Luxembourg, scribbling notes on crumpled paper, dining in cheap bistros where no one cared about his past. Sometimes he read from De Profundis, still unpublished, still a private scream into the abyss. But as the months wore on, his health declined rapidly. The injury sustained in prison, the ruptured ear from his fall, never healed properly. It became infected. He began to suffer chronic earaches, dizziness, bouts of high fever. Doctors were summoned, but their prescriptions were ineffective. He grew thinner, weaker. And yet, to the end, Wilde held fast to beauty. He once remarked, with half a smile and a full dose of irony, "My wallpaper and I are fighting a duel to the death. One or the other of us has to go." It would become one of his final witticisms, echoed in memoirs and biographies like a tragic refrain. By late 1900, Wilde was living at the Hôtel d'Alsace in the Rue des Beaux-Arts, a modest Parisian inn known more for discretion than grandeur. He lived in a single room, sparsely furnished, dimly lit. The walls, covered in garish floral paper, became symbolic to him, mocking, overripe, like a parody of art he once adored. On November the 30th, 1900, Oscar Wilde died of cerebral meningitis. He was 46. There was no funeral cortege, no noble procession. He was buried at Bagneux Cemetery under a simple cross, his name nearly forgotten. And yet, even in death, Wilde's story was not finished. In time, the world would remember not only his fall, but his fire. The injustice of his trial would spark debate. His work would return to print. His name would be spoken not with shame, but with admiration. And atop his grave, eventually moved to Père Lachaise Cemetery, a great monument would rise, a stone angel, wings spread in flight carved by the sculptor Epstein. Admirers would kiss it, defaced by critics, cleaned and restored again and again, because Oscar Wilde was never forgotten. He had written once, "We are all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars." And though he died in the gutter, alone, in pain, disgraced, he had never stopped gazing upward. In the next section, we look not at Wilde the victim, but Wilde the prophet, the misunderstood genius whose words outlived his disgrace, whose defiance planted seeds in history, and whose influence would one day help reshape society's understanding of identity, love, and art itself. History rarely whispers kindness to those who die in disgrace. It tends to close the door gently, almost politely, on lives deemed cautionary. Yet Oscar Wilde, whose name once trembled on the lips of Victorian society as both darling and deviant, refused to stay buried beneath scandal. Long after his final breath, his words kept rising, slowly, steadily, like smoke from a fire that had never truly gone out. The 20th century, for all its wars and revolutions, found in Wilde not a relic, but a prophet. A man who had lived too early for his time, who had dared to speak truths wrapped in silk, who had revealed the mask of Victorian morality with a single lifted brow. his tragedy, once whispered in shame, began to be seen not as a fall from grace, but as a crucifixion by convention. Wilde had once said, "The truth is rarely pure and never simple." In that truth lay his legacy. And it began fittingly with words. After his death in 1900, Wilde's reputation lingered like perfume, faint, familiar, disreputable. Publishers were hesitant, critics are dismissive, but those who had known the real man, the wounded genius behind the laughter, refused to let him fade. Chief among them was Robert Ross. Ross, loyal even after death, took it upon himself to restore Wilde's name and preserve his work. In 1905, he published De Profundis, the long, soul-bearing letter Wilde had written in prison. It stunned readers. Gone was the flippant dandy. In his place stood a man stripped of illusions, seeking meaning in pain. Some dismissed it as sentimental. Others, particularly a new generation of readers, recognized it for what it was, a spiritual autobiography unlike anything else in English letters. Ross went further. He collected Wilde's plays, poems, essays and stories into uniform editions. He sued for royalties. He defended Wilde's memory in the press. When society recoiled from Wilde, Ross leaned closer, ensuring that the man who once lit up London stages would not be reduced to a footnote. And slowly, the tide turned. By the 1910s, Wilde's plays were being staged again, first quietly, then with mounting acclaim. The importance of being earnest. Returned to theatres not as scandalous nostalgia, but as a comic masterpiece, critics who once condemned him now hailed his linguistic brilliance. Scholars began re-evaluating his works, not merely for their wit, but for their complexity, the way they dissected hypocrisy, subverted social norms, and dared to make beauty a principle rather than a luxury. It was a justification, but it was not yet justice. That would take far longer. In the decades that followed, Wilde's name flickered in and out of public favour, depending on the mood of the era. During times of repression, he was cautiously admired, his sexuality omitted or blurred. During times of rebellion, he was exalted, a martyr to artistic freedom and personal authenticity. By the 1950s, Wilde had become a symbol of something larger than literature. In an age when homosexuality remained criminalised across much of the world, Wilde's story stood as both warning and inspiration. Young men, frightened and confused, would find his books in dusty corners of libraries and read them in secret, laughing, aching, feeling seen. One such young man was a writer named André Gide, who wrote of Wilde as a man who had paid with his soul for his love of beauty. Another was Christopher Isherwood, who saw in Wilde the courage to write honestly about desire. The seeds Wilde had planted in pain were beginning to bloom. And then, in 1967, 72 years after his conviction, England decriminalised homosexuality between consenting adults in private. The law that had destroyed Wilde's life was finally dismantled. Parliament did not speak his name, but his shadow was there in every clause, every pause, every vote. Justice had come too late, but it had come. Even the stone knew his story was not over. Wilde's grave, moved to Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, became a pilgrimage site. Epstein's great winged tomb, a modernist, ambiguous angel, stood as a monument to defiance. For decades, admirers left lipstick kisses across the stone. Notes, flowers, even poetry were tucked into its crevices. Despite its eventual glass enclosure, love persisted. Yet the greatest vindication came not in stone or statute, but in culture. By the end of the 20th century, Wilde had been reclaimed, not only as a literary figure, but as an icon. Films were made, biographies flourished. His quotes became part of everyday speech. He was taught in schools, performed in universities, engraved on coffee mugs. But more than that, he became a touchstone for conversations about art, queerness, and justice. Wilde once joked, "One should either be a work of art or wear a work of art." In the end, he became both, but beneath the glitter of reputation lies something quieter, something more enduring. Wilde's writings, read anew, began to reveal depths long overlooked. His plays, once appreciated for their wit, were now studied for their structural genius. His fairy tales, once dismissed as sentimental, revealed themselves as philosophical parables of suffering and redemption. The Happy Prince, with its jewelled eyes and golden heart, was now understood as a metaphor for Wilde himself, stripped by society, yet giving everything he had until the very end. Even Dorian Gray, long accused of decadence, was now seen as a prophetic meditation on narcissism, repression, and the costs of living behind a mask. Wilde had not just chronicled his age, he had anticipated the next. And then came 2017. Over a century after his trial, the UK government passed the Alan Turing Law, posthumously pardoning thousands of men convicted under defunct laws that criminalised homosexual acts, including Wilde. The record was not erased. The past could not be undone. But the apology was clear. Oscar Wilde, once condemned as immoral, had been officially acknowledged as a victim of injustice. Some said it was too little, too late. Others said Wilde would have laughed, and perhaps he would have, but not out of bitterness. Wilde in his day had already seen the future. He had believed, fiercely, in the transformative power of beauty, art, and love. He had endured the brutal machinery of moral judgment and emerged. Battered, yes, but luminous. "I have lived," he once wrote, "on the side of the angels, though I never claimed one of them as a friend." In Wilde's afterlife, the angels came knocking, not in heaven, but in lecture halls, theatre balconies, and quiet bookstores, where a line from "The Picture of Dorian Gray" makes a reader pause, or a child finds in "The Selfish Giant" the first story that makes them weep, or a young person hears Wilde's name and knows that their truth too might survive the world's cruelty. Wilde was not just ahead of his time, he was necessary for it. In the next section, we step back from the man and look at the myth. We explore how Wilde, long after death, became a figure carved not in flesh, but in symbol. How artists, thinkers, rebels, and romantics all claimed a piece of him. And how the cult of Wilde evolved into something larger than life. A beacon, a warning, and an eternal flame for those who dare to live truthfully in a world that prefers the lie. To understand Oscar Wilde after his death is to enter a hall of mirrors, each reflection of him slightly distorted, refracted through longing, rebellion, tragedy, or awe. He did not merely leave behind a legacy, he left behind a silhouette into which countless generations would project their own desires and fears. Wilde the man, brilliant, flawed, mortal, became Wilde the myth, a mosaic of contradiction, a martyr of beauty, a wit in exile, a saint in velvet. It began almost as soon as the earth closed over him. In the first decades of the 20th century, Wilde's image took on a spectral quality. Artists and writers invoked his name as if it belonged to a lost god of elegance and resistance. Max Beerbohm, the satirist who had once drawn Wilde in caricature, now remembered him with reverence. W.B. Yeats, who had met Wilde in Dublin, lamented his fall in mournful verse. The mask of scandal had begun to crack, revealing something nobler underneath. Not decadence, but dignity. But this mythification came with risk. For in turning Wilde into a symbol, many began to flatten the man. Some remembered only the wit, the glittering epigrams, the theatrical entrances. They painted him as the eternal dandy, lounging with lilies and lounging even harder against morality. Others focused solely on tragedy, prison, disgrace, slow decline. Wilde became a cautionary tale whispered in closeted corners, yet neither image was complete. Both were too clean. Because Oscar Wilde, in life and in myth, defied simplicity. He was not only the author of perfect sentences, he was also the man who burned with contradictions. He adored the aristocracy, and yet mocked it mercilessly. He worshipped beauty while suffering deeply. He pursued pleasure, but understood its price. The myth may shimmer in outline, but it often misses the trembling hand beneath the prose, the dark nights spent pacing cheap hotel floors, the half-smile that masked regret. As the 20th century deepened into modernism, Wilde's myth began to shift again. The rise of psychoanalysis brought new readings of his work. The picture of Dorian Gray was now a study in repression, narcissism, and the fragmented self. Academics peered into his plays not just for satire, but for coded messages, layered ironies, and subversive truths. Wilde, it turned out, had not just been writing for his time, he had been writing through it, leaving clues like breadcrumbs for a freer future. The myth now began to appeal to rebels of all stripes. To the beats of the 1950s, Wilde was a forerunner of the outlaw artist. Allen Ginsberg, himself tried for obscenity, saw Wilde as a brother in transgression. To the counterculture of the 1960s, Wilde was a patron saint of nonconformity, proof that one could suffer for truth and still emerge immortal. To gay liberation movements across Europe and America, Wilde became a rallying cry. Placards bore his name. Marches chanted his quotes. His prison number, C.3.3, was emblazoned like a badge of honour. But it was not only in politics that Wilde's myth expanded. Artists of every kind saw reflections of themselves in him. David Bowie, with his gender-bending glam, cited Wilde's fluid aesthetic as an influence. Morrissey, frontman of the Smiths, wrapped his melancholy lyrics in Wildean references. Filmmakers too found in Wilde an eternal subject. Wilde, 1997, starring Stephen Fry, captured the tenderness behind the tragedy, the fire behind the flamboyance. It was not the first cinematic portrayal and certainly not the last, but it echoed something essential, that beneath the performances, Wilde had loved deeply, suffered honestly, and dared to live openly in a world that punished both. And so Wilde became more than a historical figure. He became a mirror. For the romantic, he was the lover who wrote with roses and died of heartbreak. For the rebel, he was the defiant wit who spat in the face of convention. For the artist, he was the visionary who insisted that life itself must be beautiful. For the queer soul, he was the ghost in the margins, whispering, "You are not alone." Yet with every new incarnation, a piece of the real man slipped further from reach. Biographers tried to reclaim him from the haze. Richard Ellman's seminal 1987 biography presented Wilde not just as an icon, but as human. Witty, yes, but also weary. Radiant, but often reckless. Ellman gave us the Wilde who wept, the Wilde who ached to be loved, the Wilde who longed for forgiveness. It was a portrait in full light, shadow and all. But even Ellman's Wilde was filtered through admiration. And perhaps that is inevitable. For Wilde himself courted myth, even in life. He played roles, poet, playwright, prophet, with theatrical flair. He sculpted his own legend in interviews, turned aphorisms into armour, styled his image with the precision of a painter. "I put all my genius into my life," he once said, "and only my talent into my works." That line, like so many, is part truth, part performance. But it reveals something essential. Wilde wanted to be remembered not only as a writer, but as a living poem. And that desire, dangerous and beautiful, became the core of the myth. Today, Wilde's face stares down from murals in Dublin and London, etched in defiance. His quotes are etched in brass plaques along boulevards. His grave remains a sacred site, marked not by flowers alone, but by messages scrawled in lipstick. letters left folded beneath stone. You saved me. You gave me words when I had none. I am not afraid any more. The myth breathes because the man spoke. But there is also danger in forgetting the wounds beneath the wings. In myth, Wilde becomes untouchable, a flawless saint, a glittering martyr. In reality, he was often insecure, sometimes vain, occasionally cruel, and frequently heartbroken. He lived in paradox, loving deeply yet keeping his distance, mocking society while craving its embrace, preaching beauty while living in the dirt of disgrace. To honour Wilde fully is to embrace the full measure of him, not just the mask, but the man, the one who read Greek by candlelight and wept when his sons were taken from him, the one who dazzled the West End and lay sleepless in a cell, the one who joked brilliantly, bleeding beneath his cuffs. It is in this duality that Wilde's greatest truth lies. He was not a man who lived without contradiction. He was a man who embodied it, who turned it into art, who stood at the crossroads of identity and chose, with a flourish, to stand still and shine. Wilde's myth, then, is not a falsehood. It is a prism, and each generation looking through that prism sees a different hue, sometimes gold, sometimes blue, sometimes blood. A red but always radiant. In the next section, we step even further beyond history into the realm of influence, tracing Wilde's fingerprints on the art, activism and philosophy of the modern era. For while the man may have died in 1900, his ideas marched on, changing hearts, shaping movements, and daring a new century to love dangerously, speak beautifully, and live truthfully. The future Wilde could not live to see. The 20th century, in all its catastrophe and colour, would become a canvas upon which his influence was painted again and again. Though he died in a modest Parisian hotel room, with little more than regret and unpaid bills to his name, the contours of his mind bled forward into decades that desperately needed what he had once offered: resistance in elegance, truth in disguise, vulnerability as strength. He had asked, rhetorically, what is a cynic? A man who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. But Wilde was no cynic. He believed ferociously in value, in the beauty of words, the power of feeling, the sanctity of love. And it was that belief that echoed loudest in the century after his fall. In literature, Wilde's fingerprints pressed onto the pages of those who came next. James Joyce, though vastly different in style, admired Wilde's unapologetic intellect. In Ulysses, Joyce's Dublin breathes with a similar tension, the individual wrestling with the weight of society, memory, and shame. Wilde had shown that literature could be a battlefield where personal truth clashed against public judgment, and the wounds could sing. Jean Genet, the French novelist and playwright, took Wilde's spirit and twisted it into his own form: defiant, erotic, criminal. Janet's outcasts and lovers bear Wilde's DNA, persecuted for desire but transcendent in defiance. Even Tennessee Williams, writing for an American audience decades later, acknowledged Wilde's influence. Blanche Dubois, trembling in her fragility, searching for magic instead of realism, might as well have been quoting Wilde. Man is least himself when he talks in his own person. Give him a mask, and he will tell you the truth. In art, Wilde's vision of aesthetic rebellion was inherited by those who saw the personal as political. Andy Warhol, with his wigs, his silences, and his glossy irreverence, called Wilde his hero. Warhol's factory, teeming with contradiction, glamour and decay, beauty and cruelty, was a Wildean theatre of the absurd. Like Wilde, Warhol understood that art was not about morality, but reflection, not about preaching, but provoking. Fashion, too, drank deeply from Wilde's philosophy. The dandyism he once embodied, mocked in Victorian papers, became the blueprint for movements like the New Romantics in the 1980s, men and women who wore velvet and eyeliner not as costume, but as revolution. Vivienne Westwood once said, "Oscar Wilde made fashion an act of defiance." She wasn't wrong. And then there was philosophy. Michel Foucault, in his late work, examined Wilde not just as a literary figure, but as a thinker of identity and transgression. For Foucault, Wilde represented the moment when sexuality and law faced devastating consequences. But more than that, Wilde symbolized a refusal to let the state define the soul, to let institutions dictate intimacy. Foucault called Wilde's prison sentence a political moment. He was right. The Courtroom in 1895 was not merely punishing Wilde's private acts. It was punishing the possibility of a different kind of man, one who did not hide, did not shrink, did not lie. In that sense, Wilde's influence reached far beyond literature and aesthetics. It reached into the shaping of queer identity itself. Before Wilde, there were homosexual men and women, but there was no public vocabulary for queerness, no framework, no face. Wilde, against his will, and yet with great purpose, became the first globally recognized figure tried, imprisoned, and destroyed for loving as he did. And because he was articulate, visible, and beloved, his downfall became impossible to forget. His letters, poems, and plays became evidence, not of crime, but of feeling. His tragedy became a rallying point. In the decades that followed, gay men and women, still criminalized, still hunted, looked to Wilde as proof they were not alone and that beauty could survive shame. In the 1950s, when the British government again intensified crackdowns on homosexuals, Wilde's name resurfaced, this time as a haunting. Men like Alan Turing, chemically castrated for being gay, existed in Wilde's long, painful shadow. Activists cited Wilde in speeches and pamphlets. His quotes adorned protest banners in the 1970s and 80s. "The only way to get rid of temptation is to yield to it," one read. Another, "I have nothing to declare except my genius." In America, the Stonewall riots of 1969, marking the birth of the modern LGBTQ+ rights movement, did not speak Wilde's name directly, but his defiance, his wit, his refusal to be shamed all pulsed beneath it. In Wilde, generations found not only tragedy, but articulation, not just failure, but foundation. His influence persisted into the new millennium. In the digital age, Wilde became a viral quote machine. His aphorisms, crafted for Victorian parlours, now decorated Twitter bios, Instagram captions, and online debates. Be yourself. Everyone else is already taken. To live is the rarest thing in the world. Most people exist, that is all. A man's face is his autobiography. A woman's face is her work of fiction. These phrases, sometimes misattributed or paraphrased, flew like sparks through screens. But beyond the quotes was something deeper. Wilde's modern resonance lies not in wit alone, but in his philosophy. The right to live aesthetically, emotionally, truthfully, even when the world forbids it. That belief found new. Champions drag performers, such as RuPaul and Lady Bunny, trace their artistic lineage through Wilde's aesthetic rebellion. Novelists like Alan Hollinghurst in The Line of Beauty painted Wildean portraits of longing in Thatcher-era London. Even television dramas. Pose, It's a Sin, Queer as Folk, echo Wilde in their blend of joy and melancholy, their insistence that beauty and suffering are often lovers. In education, Wilde returned from exile. Where once he had been excluded from reading lists for his immorality, Wilde's works are now staples in classrooms from Dublin to Delhi. Students study his satire not merely for laughs, but for insight. They see how a single line can eviscerate a social system, how humour can be sharper than rage, how performance can reveal truth, But perhaps most powerful is Wilde's legacy in the internal landscapes of individuals. For countless people, queer or otherwise, Oscar Wilde represents the voice they could not speak, the flamboyance they were told to hide, the elegance they feared to show. His words gave permission, his life gave warning, his fall gave context, and his survival in art and memory gave hope. He had once said, "An idea that is not dangerous is unworthy of being called an idea at all." Wilde himself was that dangerous idea, and the world, after years of punishment, misinterpretation, and reluctant admiration, finally began to understand it. Yet Wilde's echoes are not over. His questions remain. What is art without honesty? What is love without courage? What is life if lived only for approval? In the next section, we shift the gaze inward to Wilde's personal philosophy, aestheticism, the religion of beauty, and the deep belief that style, far from being superficial, is the soul's fingerprint. We will explore how Wilde constructed his worldview not from whims, but from principle, and how, even as it led him to ruin, it may have offered the only form of salvation he ever truly believed in. Before he was a martyr, before he was a criminal, before he was a celebrity, Oscar Wilde was a believer. Not in God, not in empire, not in family or nation or even love as others knew it. Wilde believed, with a devotion that bordered on the sacred, in beauty, not as ornament, but as meaning itself. For Wilde, beauty was not mere prettiness. It was a mode of being, a moral stance, a weapon of resistance. In a world obsessed with utility and conformity, Wilde proclaimed the useless and the unique as divine. "All art is quite useless," he famously wrote in the preface to The Picture of Dorian Gray, a line that infuriated critics and delighted thinkers. But to Wilde, it wasn't flippancy, it was theology. To understand Wilde's aestheticism is to understand the way he moved through the world, choosing the velvet path when the wool one would do, composing sentences like symphonies, curating his wardrobe with the precision of a museum piece. He wasn't trying to impress. He was trying to live correctly by the doctrine of beauty. This philosophy wasn't born in a vacuum. Wilde absorbed it early, first through his mother, Lady Jane Wilde, whose flamboyant nationalist poetry and myth-soaked storytelling taught him that truth and legend could be twins. Later, at Oxford, Wilde encountered the writings of Walter Pater, whose call to experience life through intensity, to burn always, with a hard, gem-like flame, lit Wilde's inner world ablaze. He didn't just read aestheticism, he became it, and it showed in his home, where peacock feathers curled in glass vases, where Japanese screens stood beside blue and white porcelain. In his lectures, where he preached the importance of art for art's sake, draped in velvet and lace. In his essays, like The Critic as Artist Snake, The Decay of Lying, where he turned aesthetic theory into gospel. Wilde argued that reality was overrated, that facts were dull, and lies, when beautiful, were more honest than truth. "Life imitates art far more than art imitates life," he wrote. "To create beauty was not to escape the world, but to remake it." He wasn't alone in this belief. The aesthetic movement, blossoming in the late 19th century, embraced these ideas. Artists like Dante Gabriel Rossetti, designers like William Morris, and composers like Claude Debussy all sought to strip the world of its grim industrial fatigue and bathe it in colour, sound, and sensation. But Wilde took it further. He lived it. And this commitment was radical because it refused to serve the practical. In Victorian England, a society built on productivity, propriety, and Protestant duty, Wilde's gospel of beauty was heresy. His rooms were too decorative, his languages too ornate, his ideals too soft, too sensual, too useless. Still, his philosophy was not idle. Wilde's aestheticism challenged norms because it asked forbidden questions. Why must art moralize? Why must love conform? Why must we bend ourselves into the shapes society prescribes? Beneath the lilies and laces lay rebellion. This becomes clear in The Picture of Dorian Gray, Wilde's only novel and his most precise expression of aesthetic philosophy in narrative form. In it, Dorian becomes the ultimate aesthete, preserving his youth, pursuing pleasure, avoiding consequence. His portrait, aging and corrupting in secret, becomes the repository of his sins. At first glance it reads like a cautionary tale, but Wilde insisted it was not a moral novel. He was not warning against aestheticism. He was exploring its limits. Dorian's fall is not the fault of beauty. It's the result of trying to separate beauty from responsibility. Wilde knew better than most that beauty cannot save you from pain, but he also believed it might be the only thing worth suffering for. His plays, too, are steeped in this ethos. In Lady Windermere's Farn, a woman of no importance, and An Ideal, Husband Wilde dresses social critique in the silk of high society. His characters trade barbed witticisms and glib confessions, but beneath the charm is a deep unease. Wilde reveals the hypocrisy of those who preach morality while indulging vice. He skewers the judgmental, the sanctimonious, the respectable. His true heroes are those who forgive, who feel, who understand that human flaws are not criminal, they're inevitable. Perhaps the most concentrated dose of Wilde's aesthetic gospel is the importance of being earnest. A play so light, so absurd, it almost floats off the stage, but its silliness is deceptive. In it, Wilde dismantles the seriousness of Victorian virtue. He mocks the very notion of identity as fixed. Everyone in the play is lying, pretending, becoming. And in the end, it is not virtue that saves. It is love, laughter, and the joyful chaos of being human. Wilde believed that sincerity was not the opposite of performance. It was found within it. To perform, to style oneself, to choose one's words with precision. This was not artifice. It was the highest form of authenticity. Even in prison, when the tools of beauty were stripped from him, Wilde clung to his aesthetic soul. De Profundis, his long letter from Reading Gaol, is less flamboyant, but no less beautiful. The language is more tempered, more meditative, but the core remains, beauty as salvation. He writes of Christ not as a redeemer in robes, but as the supreme aesthete, the individual who through sheer force of style turned suffering into art. It's one of the most startling moments in all of Wilde's work. For here, finally, he aligns his philosophy with spiritual clarity, not in the church, not in the state, but in the idea that to suffer beautifully is not to waste pain. It is to transfigure it. And Wilde had suffered. By the time he wrote Morphem de Profundis, he had been publicly humiliated, legally condemned, imprisoned, and abandoned by many. Yet he did not renounce beauty. He found in it the only consolation that remained. He compared his fall to a kind of baptism, terrible, yes, but purifying. I must learn how to be happy, he wrote, under conditions that are not happy. In that sentence lies the heart of Wilde's aestheticism. Not luxury, not escapism, but resilience through beauty. He was never advocating for a life of idle indulgence. He was urging people to see, to feel, to make their lives artful, even in grief. This philosophy resonates now more than ever. In a world overwhelmed by information, speed, utility, Wilde's call to pause, to notice, to admire is not trivial. It is revolutionary. To choose your words with care. Dress as a reflection of your inner self. To live in such a way that beauty is not a byproduct, but a goal. These are not acts of vanity. They are acts of resistance. Wilde didn't survive the consequences of his philosophy, but he didn't surrender it either. And that perhaps, is why it endures. In the next section, we return to the beginning, to the child on Westland Row, to the man whose story is so often told in decline. But now we look at his life not as a tragedy, but as a full arc, from brilliance to ruin and beyond. We trace the emotional landscape Wilde travelled and consider not just what he lost, but what he gave the world through the journey of becoming himself. In the quiet corner of a Dublin street, the house at 21 Westland Row still stands, red-bricked, modest, and tucked into the city like a secret. It was here, on an autumn day in 1854, that Oscar Wilde first opened his eyes to the world. He would close them for good in a dim hotel room in Paris 46 years later, his name tarnished, his body broken, his bank account empty. But the path between those 2 points, the life lived in shimmering highs and cavernous lows, was no mere descent. It was a journey of becoming, not fame, glory, or love, but toward the self. Wilde's story is often told in halves. The first, a glittering ascent, Oxford prodigy, London darling, playwright, wit. The second, a tragic fall, trial, prison, exile, death. But such division is a fiction. Wilde's life was not a rise and fall, it was a spiral, widening, deepening, drawing him ever closer to the essence of who he was, even as the world around him recoiled. To understand the full arc, one must look not just at events, but at how Wilde responded to them, how he transformed, how he endured. In his early years, Wilde was all performance and polish. He spoke in carefully measured aphorisms, dressed as if his soul were stitched into his lapels, and crafted a public persona with the discipline of a sculptor. He made himself a spectacle, and in doing so, made himself untouchable. There was elegance, yes, genius, certainly, but also armour. Beneath the silk waistcoats and gold-tipped canes was a boy still trying to impress a mother who adored myth and a society that prized masks over mirrors. He courted laughter before intimacy. He preferred applause to confession. Even in love, he kept himself somewhat at a distance, an observer of his own passions. With Constance he was kind but elusive. With Bosie he was swept away not by clarity, but by chaos. Yet something in Wilde always longed to drop the mask. That longing flickers in his fairy tales, those haunting, tender stories written for his children. In The Happy Prince, a gilded statue sacrifices himself to help the poor, his leaden heart breaking only when his purpose is fulfilled. In The Selfish Giant, a cold creature finds redemption in a child's arms. These are not simply moral fables, they are Wilde's deepest self speaking in metaphor. They are stories of loneliness, sacrifice, and the aching need to be seen, to be forgiven. As Wilde aged, the mask thinned. The Dorian Gray years, with their decadent excess and public bravado, were also years of increasing restlessness. He wrote more, dared, more loved, more dangerously. He seemed to understand that time was not on his side, not just in years, but in history. The Victorian world was closing in. The laws were sharpening, the margins were shrinking. Wilde, always daring, dared still. And then came the trials. Not just legal, but spiritual. The spectacle of 1895, the courtrooms, the headlines, the betrayal, was not only a punishment for Wilde's actions, it was a great unmasking. For the first time, Wilde could not perform, could not charm, could not write his way out of truth. And truth, laid bare, was brutal. But something remarkable happened in those years of suffering. Wilde began to listen to himself. De Profundis, written from a prison cell, is not just a letter to Bosie, it is a mirror held up to the soul. In it, Wilde admits to vanity, arrogance, blindness. But he also discovers a deeper self, one that is capable of compassion, humility, grace. He no longer sees his fall as misfortune alone. He begins to understand it as transformation. I had to pass through the fire, he writes. The suffering of my prison life was nothing to me compared with the suffering of my soul. This is not mere remorse, it is a revelation. In prison, Wilde lost everything: his children, his reputation, his health. But he also found what he had never truly possessed: silence, stillness, the ability to feel without the need to perform, to be without being watched. He began to write not as a persona, but as a person. After his release, Wilde did not return to the stage or saloons. He wandered: Paris, Naples, small towns along the coast. He lived under aliases, dined on borrowed money, occasionally glimpsed old friends. And though his outward life was diminished, something inward had deepened. He still wore velvet, though it was frayed. He still told stories, though softer now. He still believed in beauty, but not the kind that needed chandeliers. The beauty he now sought was simpler, quieter, a well-written sentence, a kind letter, late sunlight on a hotel wall. Wilde was dying slowly. The ear injury sustained in prison had developed into an infection. His body was wasting, but his spirit, paradoxically, had never been truer. He had become not the Wilde of myth, but the Wilde of truth. He once wrote, "To love oneself is the beginning of a lifelong romance." In his final years, Wilde did not love himself easily, but he had begun, at last, to understand who he was beneath the costume. And in that understanding, there was peace. The tragedy of Wilde's story is not that he fell, it's that he was never allowed to rise again. In a different time, perhaps, Wilde might have been rehabilitated, welcomed back, celebrated. But the Victorian world was unforgiving. And Wilde, always ahead of his age, died before the world could catch up. Still, his life arc bends toward grace, not fame, but meaning, not applause, but legacy. Wilde's children, raised under the name Holland, were told little of their father for years, but later in life they reclaimed him. Vivian, in particular, became a defender of Wilde's reputation, publishing memoirs, correcting slanders, and ensuring his father's work remained in print. His friends, those who remained, honoured his name. Robert Ross fought to preserve Wilde's estate, funded his tomb, and protected his writings from being lost or mangled. And generations of writers, thinkers, and artists looked to Wilde not as a warning, but as a guide. Wilde's story ends not with his death, but with his re-emergence, with every play restaged, with every quote shared, with every reader who finds in his pain a reflection of their own. He journeyed far, not in miles, but in consciousness, from the posturing boy of Dublin salons to the shattered man of Parisian exile. Wilde moved not away from himself, but toward himself. It cost him everything. But in that journey, he offered the world a map, not to fame or success, but to authenticity. He lived, he fell, he suffered, and he told the truth. And perhaps in the end, that is not a tragedy, that is triumph. In the final section, we pause, not to summarize, but to reflect. What does Wilde mean now, not as a man of the 19th century, but as a figure who lives, breathes, and speaks into the 21st? What finally is the lesson of Oscar Wilde, not just for artists, but for us all, who walk the line between performance and self, between conformity and truth? There are lives that end in history books, and there are lives that begin again after history has closed its page. Oscar Wilde's story belongs to the latter. A century after his death, his image is more alive, his voice more resonant, and his presence more necessary than ever. In a world still wrestling with the forces that once destroyed him, conformity, judgment, repression, cruelty, Wilde is no longer just a name from another age, he is a companion of ours. And so we ask at the end of this long journey, what is Oscar Wilde's lesson? Not merely what he suffered or what he achieved, but what he means. He means this, that truth, even when punished, matters, that beauty, even when impractical, is sacred, that laughter, even in despair, is a form of defiance. Wilde's life was not a model to be emulated without question, but a mirror in which we might see ourselves more clearly, masked, unmasked, struggling, shining. He taught us that art is not an escape from life, but a confrontation with it. In his finest moments, Wilde dared to say the unsayable, not with anger, but with grace. He exposed the hypocrisy of moral institutions by simply being who he was. His wit disarmed the powerful. His elegance disrupted the rigid. His vulnerability, though often hidden behind laughter, ultimately emerged as his most enduring gift. It is this vulnerability that makes Wilde more than just a figure of glamour or rebellion. In his final years, broken, wandering the cafes of Paris under an assumed name, he remained a man still capable of tenderness. He wrote to friends with humility. He forgave those who betrayed him. He made peace with silence. And still, he never abandoned his love for words, for art, for the very things that had once adorned his fame. That perhaps is the greatest victory, to lose everything and still love what made you lose it. The world has changed since Wilde's time, but not as much as it should. People are still imprisoned for who they love. Artists are still ridiculed for challenging power. Individuals are still taught to wear masks for crowd comfort, and yet Wilde walks beside all who dare to remove those masks. In classrooms, his plays are read aloud with laughter and awe. In queer history, his name is written in gold, not shame. In literature, he is not merely remembered, he is foundational. Every time a student falls in love with words, a performer finds courage in flamboyance, a writer dares to be misunderstood. Wilde is there. Every time a lover whispers a truth they were told to bury, Wilde is there. Not in ghostly visitation, but in resonance. He is, as all great artists become, a frequency. Tune in and you hear him. But he is not simply the patron saint of outsiders. He speaks too to those who have never been marginalized, those raised comfortably within the rules. For them, Wilde offers not guilt, but challenge. He asks, what do you sacrifice for approval? What mask do you wear to survive the party, boardroom, marriage, mirror? He is not ashamed. He teases, he coaxes. He suggests that perhaps the most radical act is to live beautifully, honestly, joyfully, even when the world insists that safety is more important than truth. And it is no coincidence that Wilde's resurgence has paralleled a broader cultural reckoning, with identity, with power, with the stories we've been told to believe. His life is a warning, yes, but it is also a roadmap. He did not survive history's cruelty, but his voice did. That voice continues to evolve. In recent decades, scholars have explored the complexities of Wilde's background, his Irish identity, his complicated politics, his critiques of capitalism buried beneath satire. Wilde was no simple libertine. He believed in art, yes, but he also believed in justice. He once wrote of the poor with aching sympathy, imagining a society where beauty belonged to all, not just the elite. I am not a socialist, he declared, but only because socialism takes too many evenings. The joke hides a truth. Wilde envisioned a world where aesthetic joy was not a privilege, but a right. His imagined utopia was not dour and grey, but radiant, a garden, a gallery, a library. In a very real sense, Wilde's aesthetics were political. In the 21st century, that politics feels urgent. In a culture of algorithms and speed, of outrage and spectacle, Wilde's slow, deliberate elegance is a rebuke. He reminds us that a sentence, properly crafted, can outlive an empire, that a well-chosen word can be a revolution, that living with style is not frivolous, it is resistance. Even Wilde's death teaches us something. He died in obscurity, but not bitterness. His last words, equal parts joke and lament, capture the paradox of his life. My wallpaper and I are fighting a duel to the death. One or the other of us has to go. It is funny, yes, but it is also honest. Wilde could see the absurdity of life and still treasure it. That balance between despair and delight is his most sacred legacy. Because Wilde, above all, understood people. He understood that we are contradictory, frightened, yearning creatures, that we want to be adored and left alone, that we chase status and simultaneously mock it, that we hunger for truth, even as we bury it beneath convention. He didn't scold us for these things. He illuminated them, with a smile, with a rose, with a sentence that glitters like glass. And so we end where we began, with Wilde, not on trial, not in costume, not in myth, but in essence. A man who believed beauty could save us, a man who suffered for daring to live beautifully, a man whose words still sing, still sting, still shine. There is no final moral. Wilde would not want one. He distrusted conclusions. He preferred questions, contradictions, mysteries. He once said, "The true mystery of the world is the visible, not the invisible." And perhaps what he meant was this, that the world, in all its pain and beauty, is already strange enough. We don't need to invent meaning. We only need to see. So let us see Wilde, not just the wit, not just the martyr, but the human. The child who listened to fairy tales in an Irish parlour. The young man who walked Oxford's cloisters in velvet. The writer who made the world laugh and cry. The prisoner who found grace in solitude. The exile who wrote poetry in pain. The soul who dared, above all, to be himself. He paid dearly for that daring. But in paying, he gave us a gift that endures. A voice that teaches us not to fear who we are. A vision that shows us how art and life might be one. A lesson, simple and luminous, that to live truthfully, no matter the cost, is the most beautiful thing we can do. Oscar Wilde did not die in vain. He lives in the lines we underline. He lives in the quotes we carry. He lives in the moments we choose truth, not silence. And if we are listening, even now, he is still speaking.